Hey everybody, this is Kevin Snyder, and today we have an awesome special guest. His name is Paul Artale. So let's give it up for Paul. Hey, Paul.
What's up, everyone?
Folks, Paul and I actually have a lot in common. I didn't realize how much he and I had in common until we first got connected through Toastmasters, and that's a completely separate connection as it relates to professional speaking. So Paul, if it's all right, let me tell folks a little bit about kind of our connection, and then we'll get right into you and what we can learn from you today and some tips that you can share about the speaking business.
Yeah, absolutely.
That sound good?
Yep.
Okay. So Paul and I, he has a background in student affairs, similar to me. That's how I got into speaking, and Paul is very similar to that. He's also got his doctorate degree and recently finished that, so that's an amazing accomplishment. He and I are also fraternity brothers from Delta Tau Delta fraternity, which I didn't make that connection until he made that connection with me. He and I are also fellow Toastmasters, and he is also a recipient of the Accredited Speaker credential within Toastmasters, which is absolutely huge. And I'm in process of that right now. So when I reached out to Paul, or I think Paul, you reached out to me.
Yeah, I did.
And that's where we got connected about the accredited speaker process. And we're also both professional speakers. So we might need to do a part 2, 3, and 4 to this because there's so much that we could talk about, but let's get right to you, man. Tell us a little bit about you and how did speaking even kind of come into your life? I know you have an amazing story and background, so I'll let you kind of share that, but how did you kind of get into this at the beginning?
Well, how I got into it was kind of a little bit by accident. I kind of always liked giving speeches, but I never thought about it as a career. I thought of it, if anything, as a supplement to school or business. I never saw it as something that would be my thing to get paid to do. So for me, with my story is really how it started. So if you don't know my story in a nutshell, I was born with these interesting arms and hands. So like I got like a Ninja Turtle going on here, like a Lego man hand over here. And my story is that, I was cut in high school, but then 6 years later, I walk onto a college football field, and I played defensive end for the University of Toronto. And that led to a career coaching college football as well. So people would hear that story and ask me to tell it. Because I used to, before I had my wedding ring, I would have my football ring, and that would garner attention. And so people would ask, and I kind of liked it, and people said they were inspired by it. And the funny thing is about most, I'd say if you see an athlete or someone who has some sort of physical difference, who's done something really cool in their lives, like sports or theater or something, we just do it because we want to do it, right? Like I don't go in there trying to inspire people. I just do it because that's what I wanted to do with my life. But people were having reactions to my story. And I decided I wanted to explore it a little bit more, and looked into motivational speakers. I was kind of listening to like the Zig Ziglars and Tony Robbins and those folks. And I talked about it a lot. I'd done a couple of really terrible versions of telling my story, for school or whoever kind of asked. I just fell into it. And then I kept talking about wanting to do it. And one day my wife called me out and said, listen, stop talking, start doing, or just be quiet. And so I just started doing. And I just, started hitting the pavement and just trying to find places to tell my story, and kept just working the craft, much like a stand-up comedian works their act. It took, a lot of time, but when I made that decision to commit to it, it was one of the coolest decisions I've ever made.
I love the comment you just made. What was it? Your wife said, start or stop?
Start. We'll transcribe it later. But it was to the effect of like either stop talking about it and start doing it. Is really what she said, because that's all I ever talked about. I want to do this. I want to do this. She's like, well, then do it. Stop. Stop trying.
Stop talking. Start doing, or shut up. Right.
Yep. Pretty much. Like, stop complaining. Stop saying you're better than these people. You've got talent. No one's doubting you've got the talent to do this, but you have to actually go do it. And that's what these people you think are less talented than you are doing, is that they're out there doing it. And that's a very sobering lesson I learned in the speaking, any business, I think, but especially the speaking business, that it's the hustle and the system is as important as more important than talent.
Not that this is about me, but I'd completely agree with that. I see lots of speakers who crush it. I saw one today actually on a virtual conference keynote. I logged in to watch him specifically just to see how he was doing it, how he had pivoted some of his content and his delivery. And the entire time I was watching him, respectfully, I'm thinking, okay, you're okay. I mean, but how he got that gig, I'm sure took a lot of hustle.
Yep.
So no, you're exactly right.
Absolutely.
So kind of tell us, do you have a signature talk? And what is that kind of about?
So my signature talk, the talk I'm most known for, is called Hit Hard: 3 Must-Have Mindsets to Break Through Challenges. It does talk about my journey in football, my journey from cut to college, but it also shares the mindsets and the systems that I learned from the experience that I then adapted personally to my life and teach others, because football was really cool, but my story's cool. Some people have called me the Canadian Rudy, which I wish my career ended like Rudy's did, with the limited plays he had. But when I was done, I only had one season of college ball because I was a 26-year-old rookie and all that fun stuff, and it was a 1-year program that I was eligible. Long story short, I kept asking myself, how do you what does this mean for you in your life moving forward? And I said, these are the lessons I'm going to live my life by, and on stage, that's what I teach people to do, is not make the mistakes I did, and to apply the systems to their lives and break through their adversities.
Yeah. Paul, a couple things you said in that, which I really appreciate, is I think a lot of speakers, from my experience, just coaching folks, but watching great speakers and not so great speakers, the folks that kind of struggle are the ones that talk a lot about them and their story, which is important, but they kind of forget the actionable item that the audience can take away from it, which is what's in it for them, or how can they apply it in their own life. And you talked about that 2 or 3 times. You say, hey, look, I'm sharing my story. I'm kind of sharing what are some of the pitfalls and the things I experienced, but then I'm going to help my audience apply that content in their own life. That I think that's the missing key for a lot of speakers. And how is it that you kind of were able to figure that out? Because I think a lot of speakers don't. I mean, any tips on that for somebody that's listening or watching this, how they can kind of take their story and make it not about them, but about the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure somewhere in my speaking studies, I had come across concepts like don't make yourself the hero, and what's in it for the, like everything you just talked about, Kevin, like everything that's all part of it. And so part of it was trial and error. And I first of all, let me back up and say, when you start telling your story, the natural inclination is to give a testimonial, not a speech, right? If something has happened to you of interest, you will tell the story the same way you would tell it to someone at the bar or at a family function, right? And think that just by telling the story, people will learn. And I made that mistake countless times in my career early on. And I think after learning some of the concepts and I was trying them out, I realized that really quickly that my speech was way more impactful when I started involving the audience in it, when I started asking them questions and started relating to experiences. And so when I started having people come up to me that had nothing, I mean, I look physically different. There are very few people who look exactly like me in this world. I mean, no one's as handsome. And, right. So, I mean, when people are like, I saw myself in you, and I'm like, okay, this is going to be interesting, 4'0" lady. Right. Okay. And so for me, that was how I knew. And I think for the audience, I think this might sound harsh, but it's a beautiful truth that if you accept it, is that you don't matter. Your story ultimately doesn't matter. It's a vessel. It's the entertainment part of the speech in a lot of ways. Most people will not remember you and all the specifics of your story. They'll remember how you make them feel. They might remember a couple of tidbits if you really impacted them, but they'll remember the action steps and the systems you give them, because if they're of value, they will apply them in their lives. So for me, when I'm talking to my audience, I'm a big strengths finder guy. I believe in strengths-based learning and just at leveraging the abilities you already have. So when I have people who afterwards either want to work with me and to develop their strength set, or just come up to me and say, you know what, all my whole life I've had this ability and I never used it before, I'm going to, that's value, right? Like that, if you can turn the light bulb on for them, that's how you know. So that's for me, that's how I learned it. And that's what I tell people. It's not about you, which again, if you've done something very cool, you have this passionate story you have to share. It's really hard. To get across, but that's what you have. That's essentially what you have to do. And the audience will tell you 100% if you're on the money or not with that, if they can relate to you or not, because the comments, on the evaluations, the conversation afterwards, that'll tell you. And here's the quick tip for the audience member is whenever, or for you speakers out there, is when you're done your speech and everyone's patting you on the back and saying, great speech, I loved it, instead of just saying thank you, which say thank you, because it took me years to learn to do that too, because I'm actually terrible. I like being on stage. I'm not good with applause even now, but I just say, what was your number one takeaway from it? And if the number one takeaway, you'll know. I mean, if the number one takeaway is in line with what you want the number one takeaway to be, or it resonates with you, or you start hearing the same thing over and over and it's a good thing, like lock onto that and go with it, because that's how I kind of came onto the strength piece. That's how I drilled deeper on it. It was like an offhand comment I used to make for like 3 minutes on stage. And then people are like, I really like that thing you said about leveraging your strengths. I focus on what I'm terrible at all the time. I'm like, oh, okay, let's do this now. So listen to your audience, because they tell you all the information you really need.
Yeah, that's spot on. And, and I think, not to add in my input here, but I think I'm sharing it just to kind of double down on that. I had the same experience that you did when I stopped, or when I started getting the same feedback over and over. People were telling me what they really enjoyed most. I was a little bit surprised that it wasn't really what I thought I was there for. Yeah. Like, they loved the energy. They loved, kind of the engagement. And after a period of time, I started just really tripling down on that. And that's what they knew me for my Price is Right story. They knew me for maybe this or that. But you're right. Yeah. Talk to your audience. When they say good job, say, hey, what is it about my presentation you enjoyed most? It's a simple question, but it also can engage in a real awakening.
Well, it also becomes a net to catch more stories and anecdotes, right? I'll give you a quick example. I did a storytelling workshop for a group recently, and on LinkedIn, someone commented, hey, thanks, I caught the workshop, loved it. I used your formula and had great results. Oh, really? Tell me more about that. Right? Or sorry, I loved it. I said, what was your number one thing? She said, I used your formula. I said, okay, tell me more about it. And so then she voice messaged me and told me this whole, how she reworked her speech along my formula and had these awesome results, and people were resonating before, and but I would not have known the impact had I not asked, what was your number one takeaway?
Yeah. So Paul, tell us a little bit about how you've grown your business. I mean, it's one thing to have a great presentation, inside that's a great story, right? You're a passionate person. A lot of people though won't have the success that you've had. So what is it about what you've done differently that you've learned from, that you're willing to maybe share, maybe just one thing with us, or something that you would say, hey, if you're really serious about this, if your spouse would say the same thing to you, stop talking, start doing, or shut up. Mm-hmm. Well, what did you do with that to kind of rise above where most people still struggle?
I would say 3 things. Number one, in terms of that, stop talking, right? Start doing. So, I mean, a lot of us get stuck in the concept phase of we need to have the perfect speech or the perfect marketing. My business grew, my engagements grew, and I just started putting myself out there, and honestly just started finding ways to ask people if you need a speaker. I mean, so I joke that the most basic addition to, I still do with use old school testimonial form. When I speak to small groups, it's printed on Microsoft Word, right? It's what did you like about the presentation? I'll put in a thing, and it has and before it was just I just wanted to capture written testimonials, right? And maybe a newsletter sign up. And then I added the question, would you be interested in having Paul show up at your organization or recommend me to an organization? All right. And now, you do a Rotary or, a Kiwanis Club or wherever you go to get the practice early on in your career. And all of a sudden, people are filling that part out, right? and it's so, don't be afraid to ask. Go do, but when you do, make sure you're asking. I mean, you're always stage time is important. You're always getting that work in, but use that as an opportunity to grow your business as well. So that was one, that was the early piece was putting my nose to the grindstone. I think the second piece is you have to get some help in some area. For me, it was just hiring a virtual assistant to help me locate. I'm only one person and I'm not great with spreadsheets. I'm not the details guy. It takes me forever. It drives me crazy. And so to hire someone to locate associations and do some of that grunt work that, to be honest, I hate doing. And now I've started doing that with graphic design and everything else, right? When I wrote a book, I wasn't going to do the cover myself because that would just be all sorts. That would be just a big disaster. And so for me, outsource in terms of your business, outsource what you can afford to do and what you can do and get creative with it, because you've only got so much energy, whether you're doing this as a side hustle or a main hustle, you've only got so much time and energy. And again, based on strengths based, you want to put your energy into what you do best. I do best talking to people like I'm talking to you right now and being on a stage. Those are my strengths, is using my mouth. So if I'm not using my mouth, I gotta hire someone or find a shortcut around that. So those are like the two practical ones. And here's the third one, especially for new and emerging speakers: leverage what you know and leverage who you know. So Kevin, you and I came from higher education. We've talked a little bit. Some of your early gigs were probably in higher education, right? I mean, right? I mean, because I know your background, right? and same for me, right? I started out my career like a lot of people, because the speaking industry can be very seductive, right? Like you go to a seminar and they'll talk about like, the presenter will be like, I presented at, Carlton Cards and at IBM and I made $42,000 speaking. And you're like, oh my God, that's what I want. I want the corporate CEO, but your background is not in corporate, right? Your background is somewhere else. And some of the best advice I got was leverage what you know. You're an education guy, leverage the education associations to start, and then find other likewise, some similar associations. So let's use education as the example. I was in higher education, also used to be a high school teacher, right? So K-12, higher ed, good place for me to start. That's where I got a lot of my first and early paid gigs. Then I was doing my PhD research, which was in education, but my research is actually work-life balance and organizational development. So like the whole HR world opened up to me. So then I started speaking in HR. Once I started speaking in HR, then I really started getting, because of the nature of who they were, I started getting entry into companies, right? I do a SHRM chapter, and then someone that worked at a bank would be there and say, you should come speak at our bank, right? And so leveraging what you know is huge. And for some folks that you might be listening to this say, well, I don't have those kinds of networks. You just need to sit down and with yourself or with a coach, or, and just start listing any of the associations in terms of like areas of life you've touched in business, right? It could be your hobbies, right? Like I'm a lifelong martial artist. And so for me, I looked at martial arts associations, right? I mean, I just as a place, they didn't really pan out because they don't have a lot of big conferences with speakers. They do like, dojo training and stuff, but right. You just start looking at all the different areas that you've touched a hand in, and then you start trying to build connections there. That's what accelerated my speaking business the most. And, I didn't start getting Google and Ford and some of those companies, the insurance companies, until I started leveraging education. So the first few years were miserable because I was doing civic orgs and that was it. I was getting free chicken dinner gigs and, and a few little things after that. Nothing wrong with it. I still do the chicken dinner gigs. I think I'll always do them. Those are my comedy clubs. And I say that with reverence, that those are the places where I work. I meet a lot of great connections, but until I started leveraging my world. And here's the other thing I'll just add. So you do education HR, those becomes my worlds. And then as I start doing now I've started doing more corporate diversity work for me specifically. Now corporate diversity is becoming my world. And that might spin off into something else, right? One of the diversity meeting planners I was working with said, you should do some stuff with workman's comp and the government. So maybe now the government's going to become my world, right? So that's how you build it. So start really simple. It's also a lot less aggravation, and it's a lot easier for you to speak the language you're already familiar with and trying to learn a different language. Like education, higher ed, we speak a certain language. We know what the buzzwords are, and it's way easier than you trying to figure out what, podiatrists say. Yeah.
Well, something else, Paul, I think that you kind of touched on a little bit, but I'll say it for you. I've seen you speak. You're phenomenal. A great presentation will be referred. Mm-hmm. Not so great presentations won't be.
Yep.
And I think speakers need to realize too that for a speaking business, meaning to get paid to speak at the thousands of dollars level and consistently, where you're not doing all the outreach, but people are coming into you, say, hey, will you speak for this event? Hey, we have this thing that we do every year, or hey, we have this first time event. We love, so somebody referenced you and we'd love to have you come in and present, whatever it might be. A great speech usually gets that kind of inquiry. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of speakers need to focus back on, hey, whether it's chicken dinners or Toastmasters, or like you said, leveraging the folks that you currently know, there's tons of opportunity to practice and refine and get a great speech that's crafted in a way like an artist paints a painting,
Mm-hmm.
that over time should get referrals. And if not, I mean, a speaker that doesn't have a great speech is always going to struggle.
Yep.
So, kudos for you for kind of unwrapping that for us and giving us some tips on that.
Yeah. Well, like I said, that's the most important piece is to you have to constantly work the craft. My hit hard keynote is different now than when I first gave it. It's constantly evolving. It's constantly changing. The guts of it are kind of the same, but things evolve, right? So you have to evolve with your speeches. And here's the other piece. And, I'm sure you can tell me if you've made this mistake, but early on as speakers, we all want a gig. And so we say yes to just about everything, whether we're qualified or not, or whether we like to or not. And one of the hardest things for me, another game changer in my career, was saying, you know what, I'm not going to speak on, I used to do intergenerational pieces, in the workplace. Like, that's not my jam. Like, yes, HR groups want that. And yes, there was a time where I needed the paycheck. I'll be completely honest, but there are way better people who do that because they love it and are like super experts at it. I'm not, right? So for me, I just, my webpage went from, I think 9 presentations. Like, I can't believe I had 9 up there, but 9 keynotes, which is kind of funny when you think about it. Now I'm kind of down to 4, and really that's really whittled down to 2 because my work-life balance stuff is really just, everything's under motivation for me now. It's just different shades of motivation. One's more of an HR motivation talk. One's more of a personal motivation talk. But doing that also helps. It also just think of how hard it would be to refine 9 keynotes and make them really good. Like each of them really, like you just, and if you listen, I mean, I challenge anyone to listen to your favorite comedian or speaker, listen to all their stuff. You'll see, I mean, they get really good at doing certain things over and over again. So if they're not telling the same material, they're telling story, they have mechanisms. And I don't see that as a bad thing. I see that as it's a beautiful thing when I can see, Les Brown telling his famous, story, about being on the radio and all that. I mean, he got really good at telling that story, and no one seemed to mind that he told it a lot.
Spot on, man. Wow. So for folks listening to this, just so you know, I'll include Paul's info in the description. But Paul, tell us what's the best way for folks to kind of watch, go to your website and maybe watch a video. What would you recommend that they do?
Well, if you want video, you can go to find my YouTube channel, right? So my name's Paul Artale. So it's Paul, Paul, Artale, Artale. Got lots of videos on my YouTube channel, motivation stuff, basically all the main, I kind of touch 3 main prongs of motivation, workforce development, and diversity in the workforce. So there's all sorts of videos over there. And then you can just go to paulartale.com if you want to learn more about me or connect with me on the socials. And if you're on LinkedIn, LinkedIn's always good too. Because I do a lot of stuff there, but go check me out on YouTube. Watch some motivation stuff. And get fired up.
Paul, let's get real for just a moment, because the world that we're living in right now has been completely impacted with COVID-19 and the whole, as a speaker too, shifting into this, virtual presentation delivery, and I mean, just how have you been handling that, and kind of any thoughts you have with how the speaking industry, as well as every industry though, but the speaking industry is obviously, we're in the process of being molded. Any thoughts or tips on how you're adapting to that or how you're adjusting?
Yeah, so I was fortunate in some ways because number one, at least the current gigs I had on my calendar, most of them did not go away. They got put virtual or they got postponed, but financially, none of that. I wasn't impacted in the immediate future like a lot of folks. And while that was going on, as I was finishing my PhD, I was also pivoting to more virtual. I'm looking at being more motivational media, for lack of a better term, right? So I want to do on stage. I want the world tour with people cheering for me on stage, but I also want the digital presence to be a lot more prominent. So I was kind of going that way. So for me personally, that's the direction I'm going, as I'm launching a couple podcasts in the next year and books and just a whole bunch of different things. And so for those out there in the speaking business, I think you have to be realistic about what you want to evolve into. And I think you have to look at what your current offerings are. And I think it is smart to have, what's the virtual version of that look like? Like the kind of the sad part is, like, hit hard can't be done virtually the way I do it. It's a lot of yelling and it's a lot of call and response with the audience, a lot of interaction. I can't do that the same way virtually. So what are other ways I can interact with the audience and tell my story with so keeping the integrity of the message and the integrity of the feelings without, being stuck on what I can do on stage. So I think you have to learn, is there a virtual equivalent to what your program is? If not, then you got to pivot to something else. The good news is the answer to question one is usually yes. It just might look different. I think right now in the speaking industry, I would say have game plans, figure out the virtual piece, play with technology, and don't get and talk to meeting planners. I mean, really talk to them to what they want, because right now there's a lot of people selling bells and whistles for for virtual presenting and stuff. You need this thing, or you need to have this certification to be a virtual presenter, or meeting planners are looking for this. And I would just say, talk to meeting planners. My guess is that, we know we're not going to be on a physical stage for a long time, for quite a bit. I mean, I just got another notification that something I put in for a gig I put in for just said, we're just not doing an event this year. Right. So yeah, those are drying up. So think about your virtual programs, and also think it's a good time to think about your virtual presence. Think about building a virtual community. You don't need a lot of people. And by a lot, I don't mean you don't need 2 million YouTube subscribers to have a thriving business, right? There are different business models out there. Build your community digitally, figure out how you can help them in a digital format, and then go do it. If you're doing more corporate stuff, I think webinars might be a really good place, or maybe it's more consulting, right? If you're more like, I dabble in the business to consumer, the one-on-one coaching thing, it's going to be, more private coaching and more private coaching communities. That's where I want to go. Yeah. And I think that's what people have to do. But you have to, I liken it to when I was when I was a college football coach, I was always the film breakdown guy. I used to love doing the game planning. That was the thing. I love that probably more than on-field coaching sometimes. The idea to look at film, break it down, analyze it, get with the coaching staff and say, this is what we've seen. So here's the layout of what we think is going to happen. But then you start plugging in other variables, and you start just saying, okay, if X happens, then we do Y. If Z happens, then we go back to whatever plan. And I think that's what you got to do. You got to say, yes, it's going virtual. What happens if 6 months from now a meeting planner says, we want you on a stage with like 30, some sort of hybrid experience? Are you ready for that? Right. So start thinking about the possibilities, because they're going to happen. And the last thing I'll say on that is also just think about, what are you personally comfortable with? I'm not a huge fan of traveling right now. I'm just not, because of, I got young kids and all that fun stuff. And, so that's a choice I'm making as a speaker, and I'm okay with that. But I think as a speaker, you have to know, because if tomorrow you get a call saying, we want you to fly to Tampa or to San Francisco, and we want you to speak in front of 3,000 people, let's just say hypothetically it's feasible. Are you going to be okay doing that? If the answer is heck yeah, then that's your choice. If the answer is I don't know, then you really have to think about that answer, because if it's anything that's not a heck yeah, you shouldn't be doing right now.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. I think, a lot of times we put things out kind of to the energy of the universe, and we track that back. And I'm not going to get into a philosophical discussion or religious discussion about that, but so much of my speaking business resulted when I felt ready. Mm-hmm. Or when I kind of put it out there that that next opportunity interestingly kind of came along. Yep. Down the road. Well, Paul, I tell you what we're going to do is we got to do at least a part 2, because one thing we didn't even get into was your book, The 2-Year-Old's Guide to Work-Life Balance, which, yeah.
There you go. So, shameless plug.
Oh, no, I'm glad you did, because we can talk a little bit about book writing too. We could even talk about Toastmasters and the fact that you've been to the semifinals of the World Championship twice.
Yep.
Yeah, we could, and there's other questions about speaking that frankly we didn't even get to that I thought we could ask. So if you're all right with a part 2, we'll schedule a part 2 sometime soon.
We'll get a trilogy going.
A trilogy, yeah, I like it. But folks, check out paulartale.com, and we'll look forward to connecting with Paul again in the future.
Thanks, Kevin.